I think everyone, we're ready to begin. As I said, once again, thank you for joining us today for this InTouch series of talks. The talk today is called Unravelling UWC, the changing nature of a UWC Atlantic education, reflections on the past, present, and future. I'm really lucky today with the speakers who've said that they're happy to speak today. We're being moderated today by Rhian-Anwen Hamill, who's one of our AC alum from the class of 1985. I'll just pass over to her now. Rhian, are you there?
I'm here. I'm busy having a private conversation with Roger Fletcher, my housemaster, who's just sent me a message saying hello. So hello to Roger and lovely to see you. Thank you, as Keith says, everyone, for joining us. We are really talking about the history of Atlantic College, the history of the UWC movement, and I suppose also really as that pertains to the history of the IB itself, and how it's evolved since its inception, what's changed and also what's the same, remarkably. We're going to do that through the eyes of three very significant figures in the movement, I would say. People who've been teachers, directors of study, deputy heads, headmasters, etc., in various UWC colleges, and also have held roles in the IB, and who've seen everything grow at first hand, it's fair to say. So very sort of rich perspective on things. I'll introduce all three of them in turn, and they will then speak for 10 minutes or so individually on their own experience of being at Atlantic College and then elsewhere. And then we'll enable a discussion between them and also with you, because we're very aware that, you know, this is not really an audience that we're talking to. This is a community, and it's really envisaged that this will be a family kind of discussion, if that's not too daft a word to use. We do all feel something pretty strong, which is why we're here. So we'd like you to participate, please, if you want to. So make your point or ask your question in the chat function, as Keith said. And if you'd like to do that live yourself, then just say that at the beginning of your point or your question. Just type live, and then we'll come to you, unmute your microphone, and you can speak. Otherwise, one of us will ask the question for you. So that will be in about 20 minutes or so. So yes, let me start then by talking about Andrew Maclehose, who's going to talk first, and I'll come to him in a second. So he is going to talk about AC and the movement in the 60s and 70s. He joined first as a teacher in 1966 to teach economics. He's also taught history, he taught theory of knowledge, he taught philosophy. He became the director of studies and then the deputy head, and then went on to found and be the founding dean in UWC USA, and has also had senior roles at Adriatic, Southeast Asia, and he will give us quite a lot of colour, as you can tell from that. He's also got the most heroically remarkable CV from anyone I think I've ever met, because I've just been reading it. And in many ways, I think in those early days must have embodied what Atlantic College was meant to do, not just for the teachers, but also for the students. So I'll come to him in a second. And then we're going to talk to Gareth Rees, my fellow Welsh person and indeed internationalist, who started on the same day actually as I did in 1983, and was 26 years at Atlantic College, teaching first economics and history, then being the director of studies, then being the lifeboat operations manager, and then the vice principal. And Gareth also was a house parent and has been very involved with the IB. So I think that's also a really interesting thing for us to hear him on, including being chief examiner in various subjects. And then last but not least will be Peter Howe, the current principal, who's been with UWC since 2005. His first role at Adriatic, where he eventually became the Rettore, and then head of college at Maastricht. And he's been obviously at Atlantic College since 2017, as we know, probably sadly, I don't know if you do know, but he's going to be leaving in the summer to go to warmer climes, let's say. And he's had a significant impact in his time at UWC Atlantic, and I think will leave a legacy of significant innovation, really. So we'll hear a little bit about that, keeping AC dynamic, I suppose, and keeping the movement dynamic. So that's enough from me. Andrew, it would be wonderful if I could invite you to turn on your microphone and to tell us a little bit about what AC was like in the early days and how your involvement continued through your time at the college and then into other colleges over the years you were involved.
Well, thank you very much. You're very kind. I won't talk really about anything other than AC, but there we are, 55 years ago, and I see there are one or two others who are on there who were around 55 years ago, which is very exciting. I'll probably add almost nothing that's original, just a few recollections. And as the Queen said the other day in relation to Meghan Markle, recollections vary. So I trust that if anybody has very different memories, they'll not be slow to speak up. So it was extraordinarily lucky to be able to join Atlantic College, which I'd never heard until I arrived, and at least until I saw the advertisement. Everybody who goes there is blown over by the castle and the sea. And I was interviewed by, everybody now calls him Desmond Howe. Nobody would dare, at least no student or teacher would have dared to call him Desmond Howe. To the day that he died, I called him Sir, and I'm sure there were lots of my generation who did. Anyway, interviewed down by the sea because he was, as always, in his shorts supervising the rescue boats and the sailing and so on that was going on. The castle is magnificent, was magnificent, but very different in those days. None of the academic buildings had gone up. I can remember the foundation stone being laid by Sir George Schuster of the Science Building in 1966. There were nissen huts and wooden huts all over the place. Students, we had classes in the tithe barn and the castle, dormitories in both of those. So it was a little bit different. What is now the art department, the music department, the cavalry barracks were ruins. They were restored in the Sutcliffe era and put to very good use. Now, when one arrived, and I was the most junior of junior teachers and stayed that way for a very long time, you absolutely had to be in awe of what that first group, Admiral Howe and his colleagues, had achieved in 4 years. The academic program was relatively straightforward. I'll talk about that in a moment. The main thing that everybody was interested in was the rescue service. The whole idea of it, people still they believe in it now, but it was a brand new idea, the idea of international peace and understanding. It's almost become a cliche now, but it was an absolutely brand new idea, the idea of bringing students in to an international school from all over the world. There were one or two other international schools, like Geneva, for example, but they were for people on the whole, for students whose parents were living in Geneva or Eunice in New York. First ever sixth form college. They're all over the place now, but it was a brand new idea and a lot of people were very skeptical. But far and away the most striking thing was the rescue service. And of those, frankly, the rescue boats were the ones that attracted most attention from elsewhere. So here was Admiral Howe and the students literally designing, building and operating these boats, which became the Atlantic class used all over the world. And in those days, whenever there was a call out, and they were very frequently happened, the whole student body would rush down to the sea, launch the boats. If there was an exam going on, it was very hard to control people to get them to stay in the exam. But anyway, they went down there. It was students who managed the boats, ran the boats in the rescue. he was a great believer in practical skills. That was why he wanted everybody not only to be designing the boats, we had to build our own canoes in beach rescue. Everybody who went to sea had to make their own wetsuit under the direction of his wife, Naomi. The cliff rescue designed and built the cranes. So he was a huge believer in practical skills. And as I'll say in a moment, a bit suspicious of the IB, perhaps for very good reasons. So starting the rescue services from scratch, as they had been, staff and students, a huge amount of inventiveness and energy had gone into that. For beach rescue, which I was a little bit involved in at first, there were no beach rescue units, no lifeguard clubs in Wales. And they were started by, every one of them, by Chick Thompson, who was our director of activities. And if you go to these clubs now, I think you'll find a big picture of him in every one. And so in the August period, which many of you will remember as being the most fun part of the whole 2-year experience, started in July, finished in September. So you had a very short summer holiday. 4 hours every afternoon, you were on the beach patrolling, except for the real key beach rescue people. And I see David Collier there, who became the team which won the Senior British Surf Lifesaving Championship, 1969. The next year they would have won it again, except there was a team entered in the last minute from South Africa, and this was in the apartheid days, a white team which the Atlantic College crew refused to go up against, and so they didn't win that time. Training went on all the year round. I can remember being on the beach with a group of canoes at Sundown on some cold November afternoon, and the students were all playing with kayaks in the surf. And this old man, he seemed old then, he's probably much younger than I am now, came up to me and asked what was going on. And I explained that. He said, "That's real education," which it was. I haven't mentioned the rescue, I haven't mentioned the social service, which became hugely, in time, a big part of the operation. But students were ready to go anywhere. When that terrible Aberfan disaster happened in October '66, students were up there filling sandbags in the middle of the night. When there were forest fires in 1976, there were students there putting them out. It was part of the way of life. And it was 7 days a week. As it happened, classes went on Saturday mornings till the late 70s. But even then, once the classes had finished, everybody was out there canoeing, sailing, cliff rescue organized mountain trips and so on. So the program undoubtedly went on the whole week. And as Admiral Howe used to say, the Christmas term began in July. There were no half terms or anything like that. The Christmas term began in July, virtually without a break, except for the September project. Now, less dramatic was the academic program. All the teachers obviously had to work up their own A-level classes when the college began, but also, and this was a sort of preview of the IB, every teacher was expected to also work up what was then called a subsidiary class, unexamined, because Admiral Hall recognized that you needed more than the 3 specialist A-level subjects. Anyway, when the IB was introduced, at least was thought of, and it was thought of not at Atlantic College, but in Ecolant in Geneva, all the Atlantic College teachers were invited to take part in producing the syllabuses. And this happened usually over a weekend. Every subject obviously was different. Weekend either in Geneva or in Oxford. You arrived on the Friday evening. By Sunday lunchtime, you had to have produced, the team had to have produced the higher level syllabus, what was then called the subsidiary syllabus, and the assessment by lunchtime. I think it now takes 7 years to change it, but that was done in a weekend. Sometimes there was a misunderstanding between the Francophones and the Anglophones. The chairman of the meeting was the great Alec Peterson, who got over that problem by producing some minutes in English and some minutes in French to keep everybody satisfied.
Andrew, could I want to pick you up on something you just said there, because I think it's interesting in the context of debates going on at the moment around freedom or lack thereof of teachers to teach what they want to teach and not be hidebound by heavy demands of curriculum. I saw that Lucy Kellaway had written something a couple of weeks ago in the FT about this, and I know it's a debate that college has been having in recent times to try to take back some freedom for teachers to influence what they do with students, and indeed for students to have agency over their own, following their own noses into their interests, I suppose. And it does sound as though, you know, by nature of need, you guys were able to do that as teachers in those days.
Well, that's absolutely true. We were just extremely lucky. Now, I have great admiration for the teaching staff there now, but we had the great good fortune of, in fact, you know, helping to create the syllabuses, and this happened with theory of knowledge too. It happened with, you know, we had a great input into extended essays. It was just a good time to be alive.
Thank you.
And very unprescriptive, and obviously you didn't get it right the first time, and so there were continual changes being made to the syllabuses.
A great time to be alive. I like a great time to be alive. I like that remark. I'm going to, if I may, turn to Gareth, because you mentioned the theory of knowledge, you mentioned the extended essay and these things that you helped create. And I know that Gareth is still the chief examiner, I think, for the extended essay, or at least has been, and is marking as we, perhaps not as we speak, but certainly was last time I spoke to him. So Gareth, noswaith nes I weld ti, joined in 1983, as I said. Perhaps you can take up the baton and talk about, you know, what you saw relative to what Andrew's described and where it went in that long era that you spent influencing and being in the movement and at the college.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody. And there's so many people I'd love to have a chat with privately from the past. I arrived in 1983, and I was appointed by Colin Jenkins, and I came into what appeared to be a very well created and nicely wound up watch, some kind of timepiece that that had huge integrity in the way that it worked, and it worked very smoothly, and I had to sort of fit myself into that. And it was all very surprising. I came from a higher education background and felt exactly that same feeling of luck at being there that Andrew described just now. And what I'd like to do is, I arrived in 83, I left in 2009, and I'd just like to pick up some themes and explain what happened to them, particular features and what happened to them between 83 and 09. So I'll just do that thematically quickly, and hopefully it'll pick up one or two things that you might want to discuss afterwards. First theme is one of isolation. I came to an isolated campus in a beautiful corner of the Vale of Glamorgan, which I happen to know because I brought no cultural diversity because I grew up around here. And my first memory was of being in the old Randolph-Hearst pool in about 1958, when the college used to open on Sundays in the summer for local people to come in with picnics. So I was there even before the college was. But in 83, it was still very isolated. The students came for 2 years, some of them quite literally. They didn't go home throughout that time. And I couldn't even imagine what their parents must have felt trusting them to us for 2 years, knowing they wouldn't see them until 2 years later. I'm sure Rhian-Anwen can remember people in her year who were in that position. There were there were 2 payphones on the campus, one by the main gate and one in the social centre, and 1 television which was available to the students. So the students were in effect cut off. They were isolated from home. They were isolated from the real world to a large extent, and they were at our mercy as teachers. Communication with the outside world was pretty much through Don the Porter and the pigeonholes. Don the Porter was a very important figure in the college, and so were those pigeonholes, and you could see students milling around there at break when the mail arrived, because that was the main means of communication. Parents were hardly involved as stakeholders. Even when I started as Director of Studies in '98, it was relatively unusual to be in touch with parents. But by 2009, I was in touch with parents every day because they felt more entitled and connected to their young, and because the isolation had broken down in every sense. There were, in 2009, it still seems quite primitive now, there were payphones in houses. Students had mobile phones, or some of them did. But a lot of students had laptops and email and could watch movies in their dorms at night if they could get them connected. They were much more connected to the world outside. So the sort of unique, isolated, beautiful campus had, in a way, broken down a bit. My only regret in that was that some parents exercised an influence over their kids when they were at the college, which bordered on the unhealthy in a few cases. Second theme, outdoor education. Obviously, we have to touch on this. As Andrew described, the search and rescue services and sailing and sea canoeing and also environmental monitoring and estate service and so on. There's a lot of outdoor education, but the rescue services were probably at the core of it. Teachers were employed not only for their classroom prowess, but also for what service they might go into. Certainly 50% of my interview was about what I was going to contribute as by way of service and potentially as a house parent, which Ellie and I were lucky to do a bit later. The teaching wasn't incidental, but it wasn't the dominant theme of my interview, even in 1983. Now, as far as the outdoor education was concerned, the Lyme Bay tragedy in 1993 changed absolutely everything. For those who don't know, there were 8 youngsters sea kayaking off the coast of Dorset. They got into difficulty and 4 of them sadly drowned. And that triggered the whole business of compliance, regulation, frameworks, risk assessments, all sorts of things influenced what we could as a college and could not do outdoors. Within the ILBs, the lifeboat service, within about 18 months of that, it was decided that we could no longer put all student crews out on the lifeboat, because that simply, in the context at that time, was just wrong, and we had to fall into line with what was happening as far as the legal framework was concerned. So outdoor education at the college became more compliant. One might say better regulated, possibly, or not, but it certainly, I think, became less adventurous, and it also, incidentally, made it more difficult to recruit teachers, because they would have to have not only teaching prowess, but qualifications in outdoor education, or whichever of the many services they would join. And it's worth remembering, since Andrew raised it, that social service was still huge, and every student was expected to do it for at least 1 term during their time at the college. Classroom education. Teachers once appointed, when I joined in '83, were trusted to choose their own path through the IB curriculum, because of course it was all IB. There was no appraisal system in '83, and so we were, I suppose, just trusted to pick our way through the syllabus in the way that we wanted to, and that was wonderful. It was so stimulating and exciting, because you could make use of the diversity in your class, make use of the events in the outside world that you wanted to, and the syllabus was there to be met for the exams at the end. Because in '83, when the IB was getting mature, it still didn't have coursework in most subjects. I can remember my predecessor as Director of Studies, Roger Fletcher, who's there, on my screen, I can remember looking at his coursework calendar for the students, and the coursework calendar didn't have very many lines in it. You know, of course there was TOK and extended essays and so on, but there weren't many lines of subject coursework. That was to change dramatically, so that by 2009, it was 2.5 pages long. And a typical student would have a deadline that counted towards their final results every 10 days during the 3rd term. So that changed the nature of the education, and it started to expose the wonderful fib that we used to tell the IB about how many hours we taught, which was roughly 2/3 of what the IB recommended right up to 2009. So we got away with that, but it got harder to allow the students to devote the hours to the important part of their education, which was outside the classroom. I'll run on very quickly. The admin of the college was very lean. In 1983, there was a principal, a vice principal, a director of studies, and a bursar. And the director of studies was, of course, Superman. It was Colin Jenkins. He was the IB coordinator, the timetabler, the university guidance officer, the exam officer, supervised the reports, and he was the overall manager of all the services and activities. And that was just his day job, because he was also heavily involved in, so he did everything that all the other teachers did on top of all of that. Now that, of course, has changed, and those functions have been split so that many more people are involved in those administrative aspects. It did stay the same as Colin's role through Roger's time as Director of Studies and mine, except that responsibility for services tended to go off to other people, and also aspects of student welfare, but the core functions remained there. The houses, well, the houses were the same, I think, pretty much all the way through. One thing you might like to know is that in 1986, when we became house parents, there was an allowance paid, and the house master was paid 80% of it, and the house mother, whatever they were called, the wife, I think, was paid 20%. So I can remember at a meeting with some governors, when Ellie was asked a question by the governor, she replied, well, of course, I'm only 20% responsible for what happens in the house. Fortunately, things did change as far as that was concerned. And what the house parents were expected to do was to implement rules. There was a code of conduct, and that lasted till about 1990, when it was renegotiated largely by Glyn Harbour, a wonderful teacher, with the students. And after that, we had a code of conduct, which from a house parent's perspective was good, because you could lay a very heavy guilt trip with that, and that way help the students to find better forms of behaviour. University, I spend 1 minute on that. In 83, universities were either generous to students taking the IB or completely ignorant of it. I'll always remember Somerville College in Oxford asking one of the students for 3 1s at high level, which actually is surprisingly hard to do. So we had to write back and say, maybe you should look up the IB and find out how it's actually scored. When I took over from Roger in 1998, we had 28 offers from US universities, not to 28 different students, some of them had several. And when I left, we had 248 from the US. The reason for that, of course, was Shelby Davis, who changed the destination and pathway for the students through his amazing generosity. A-level grade inflation led to British universities being quite mean with their IB offers, their conditional offers, and that's despite the fact the IB experienced absolutely no grade inflation throughout the whole of that period. So it gradually got more unfair to British universities, and it got a whole lot easier to be appreciated by American universities. Little things happened during my time which turned out to be very important. The international show, I think, started in about 1983. Someone might correct me on that. And it can be strongly associated with Catherine Jackson, as can the Link Family Scheme, which I think started later in the 80s, and again was something that Catherine Jackson was intimately involved in. The IB connection, was, well, I won't go through all this now because it'll probably come out later on, but
yeah,
the important...
I think we can pick that up with once Peter's spoken, Gareth, but that's
Right.
that's something I think that we do want to talk about. I'm going to just, if I may, thank you so much for all of those remarks. I'm going to just pick up a couple of things that are coming out of the chat, and then I'm going to hand over to Peter. Just to remind you, when Peter's spoken, it would be great to open up the floor a bit. So if you'd like to make your comments in person, please just say so in your remark, type live, and I will come to you. There's some very nice appreciative comments of you both. Andrew, some of your old students are commenting about how pleased they are to see you and what a difference you made to their lives. A number of people, I mean, one person, Ulrich Eckler, says the individual teachers formed us. And we had the space to discuss and develop intellectually, as long as you weren't messing around in boats every minute of your life. And people agreeing with you, Gareth, that, you know, it was very isolating. And the postal strike, someone remembers, from AC 70 to 72, Emily Ward, really added to that in the very old days. No internet, obviously, but we are reminded that television, you know, brought people in touch with the Six-Day War and some of those memories. I remember the miners' strike when I was at Atlantic College, obviously being Welsh, as well as trying to perform on the international evening with Eluned and I in Welsh costumes, very embarrassing. So yeah, I and someone else remembers that all they really had was the aerogram, the blue airmail paper that you folded up and sent a letter. So really good to reminisce. David Kay, by the way, says that he wouldn't be an economist now if it wasn't for Andrew Maclehose's course in those days. So it's really nice to see these tributes being paid, and also that, you know, the legacy, I suppose, of education in that era having these ramifications. So Peter, I'm going to come to you now, and I'm going to mention a couple of themes that are coming up in the chat so that you can perhaps address them. People really want to understand in sharp relief the difference nowadays. Gareth's touched on that, but I think if you can comment, and also I think for the future, the financial sustainability of the college and the movement is, I think, in people's minds. So why don't we start with those two, as well as the remarks you were going to make anyway. And very good to see you.
This is exactly what I hope for, is just to listen to Andrew and Gareth and talk about this incredible history of this incredible place. And so I'm really pleased with this, and I really have nothing to say whatsoever. But I deliberately chose my background. I was thrilled to see Anne Brearley on the call, because I had never heard of UWC growing up in Canada, even though Pearson College was the second or third, depending on your version of UWC history. And so I had no idea about Atlantic College, but I did have the privilege, also coming out of the university sector. And it's interesting, both Gareth and Andrew were history and economics teachers. And in fact, I was hired to be an IB history and economics teacher as well. So there's a little bit of conspiracy here. But I started in 1997 in Toronto. And in the fall of 1997, Gareth Rees came to Toronto to lead an IB workshop in economics. And I was absolutely inspired by Gareth, and have literally stayed in touch ever since. And he's been such a mentor for me in everything that I've done. And one of the things that back then, Gareth, there still was not coursework quite yet. It was about to be introduced in economics. And I think that is something that Gareth touched upon that really deserves attention in terms of the changing nature of an IB education, because the freedom to have 2 years to guide students towards a goal that they didn't have to worry about for at least 18 months of those 2 years was such a privilege as a teacher, and that you weren't responsible for their final assessment. So very much the coach mentor model, but there were no IB textbooks. You had to develop your own course materials, and that's where I leaned on Gareth a lot, especially with development economics. But that made students have to pay attention as well. I mean, now the IB publishing industry, to my mind, has destroyed IB teaching, because every student has an IB authorized textbook that literally goes bullet point by bullet point. So the students think they all have it all in the book versus being there for the experience in the classroom and the learning that can take place in the classroom. But I did get involved with the IB in curriculum development in the early 2000s, and I met a teacher, Henry Thomas, who taught at UWC Adriatic. And that's when I first heard about UWC. Gareth, I don't think, or maybe he did, or I didn't realize where he actually worked. And the idea of UWC just blew me away. I thought it was too good to be true. And I literally wrote to the heads of UWCs for 4 years, trying to get my foot in the door at a UWC so I could experience this model of education. And in fact, David Sutcliffe, who I think the majority of people on the call will remember, was working on a project in Mostar at the time. And he was the only head or former head who replied to my missives. And he said, "You're precisely the type of educator that UWC needs. I'm sorry Mostar isn't starting, but keep trying." So I was hired in 2005 at UWC Adriatic as the head of economics and IB coordinator. And that my background is my family back in those days. Moved with young family to Italy, were house parents right away, thrown into the deep end. And I remember meeting Anne Brearley very early on, and our son, who's in the Canada t-shirt, had been in an orienteering competition, and Anne Brearley, who I hadn't met at that time, came up to me and introduced herself, and I said, "I hear your son's very good at orienteering," and took him under her wing. So we threw ourselves into this experience, and I think the greatest memory that I have of UWC in those early days, which I've tried to carry through, is the idea of giving trust and authentic responsibility to students. It transformed me as an educator to start from that position, as opposed to maybe arrive at that position with a number of students. And as Gareth has mentioned, and Andrew as well, that left me as an educator to learn as much or more from my students as they were learning from me. And when I had the good fortune of becoming Rettore in Adriatic, it was actually a crisis of governance at the college. The head was asked to take early retirement on the 29th of August. And the leadership team there was very lean, as Gareth has mentioned. At Adriatic, it was the head and the deputy head. That was the leadership team. It's a smaller college. So I was the deputy head. And suddenly I was head, and my wife Sally and I were house parents. So there was no way I could recruit anyone at that point in time. I didn't have anyone I could put into that position. So I turned to the students and said, "This has happened. I need your help. Let's do this together." And they rewarded me in spades for that trust that I put into them. So when we moved to Maastricht in 2012, which was a nascent UWC, they were converting a Dutch international school to UWC. I turned to the National Committee, residential students, and said, "We need to turn this into a UWC." And that's precisely the project we worked on for 5 years together. So arriving here at UWC Atlantic, and you'll notice I call it UWC Atlantic versus Atlantic College, because one of the things that struck me is AC founded the UWC movement, and yet it was very insular. It was just, because it had invented UWC, I don't think it thought about UWC. And one of the most energizing aspects of UWC for me, that we were a group of like-minded colleges around the world. And there were so many interesting things taking place at other UWCs that I felt we could share best practice and bring together as a movement. And that just wasn't really happening. I mean, Gareth, when he was director of studies, did a fabulous job of connecting us all and sharing best practice. But I thought we could do this across all subjects, all activities, services, etc. So that's the real revelation I had coming to UWC Atlantic. Was at some point, I feel we lost the urgency of innovation as being a core aspect of UWC. It had become about opportunity. It was all about, scholarships and access, which of course is critically important to the experiment as well. But if we're not innovating in education, if we're not pushing the envelope, if we're just delivering the IB in its current package, which is incredibly prescriptive, every subject has, you know, a multiple page syllabus with bullet point by bullet point. As Gareth said, there's coursework in every single subject. And in fact, now you need to begin coursework in the fall of the first year if you're ever going to get through it by the time they leave. You know, when Gareth retired, I mean, that's over a decade ago, you can add a few more pages to that coursework calendar. And to manage the mental health of students and not have it all in the third term, you really have to spread it out over that period. So part of what we're trying to do here now is reimagine education for the 21st century and try and deliver a rethink of the diploma. And the number one thing we're after is time. Because as Andrew noted, and Gareth noted, the resource, and speaking like a good economist, that's really in scarcity for students today at UWC is time. And the time for the teachers who very much believe still that what takes place outside the classroom is as or more important than what takes place inside the classroom, to have that space to work with the students, and for the students not to be having a breakdown thinking, but I have to do all this coursework, I have to complete this, that, and the other. Because a couple of other things have changed even since Gareth's retirement. Universities have even become more competitive than they were before. So it's incredibly challenging for students to get into university. But also parental expectations and involvement have gone off the charts. I mean, when I started at UWC Atlantic in 2005 and was director of studies in 2006 and 7, as Gareth said, I had virtually no contact with parents. I dealt with national committees, maybe once or twice a year a parent would get in touch, but we were trusted to deliver on the promise of UWC. And now students don't break away from their families in the same way. I mean, I would expect most of our students are in weekly contact, if not daily contact, with their parents. When I started at UWC Atlantic in 2005, it was the same cutoff. We didn't have internet except in the computer room, and it only had certain hours a day. And I remember the day, because I was still a house parent, when internet was introduced to the day room. And whereas before all the students were facing to the center and having conversation, it was plug-in internet, they suddenly were all facing the wall. And they were having early Skype conversations with their friends at homes or their family. So we don't have that same privilege that we had before of literally having parents back off and give us the time and space to be working with our students in delivering the character education that I think UWC has always been defined by. So I can probably leave it there. I could go into more details about the Changemaker curricula that we're piloting this year, about the Ways of Life program, how we're trying to restore that connection to the sea that's always been at the heart of UWC Atlantic. But I think I can leave it there for my preliminary comments.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, I think we should come back particularly to Changemaker, but in the meantime, whilst you're talking, apart from a rather heated discussion about uniform, which is going on in the chat, I just want to draw your attention to a question or a point, really, which I think you can all comment on, which is whether or not there is a kind of movement to rethink education now, perhaps in the light of the pandemic. Certainly we are seeing signs in the mainstream education world, some of which are perhaps worrying, like, oh, let's teach them more to catch them up and put more pressure on the students. But some of which are at least asking about the value of exams and preparing to exams. And a number of people are saying in the chat, you know, perhaps the IB is well positioned, or perhaps the UWC movement is well positioned to influence the IB. I wonder if you can comment on whether this is a moment in time, and if it is, what are the very simple things that you'd like to see changed? Keep parents out. I've got that point, Peter. Tick. Gareth, would you like to say something about that? And then I might come to Andrew and Peter again in a second.
Yeah, the relationship with the IB is interesting because in the early 80s, Atlantic College and the other UWCs, the few UWCs, were quite a decent proportion of the candidate entry. Now with 17 or is it 18 UWCs, it's a very small proportion. So the influence has declined just simply because of that, because of the changing nature of the relationship. However, academically, an awful lot of teachers at Atlantic College got very involved with the IB over time, and there were people who led lots of workshops and therefore influenced lots of other teachers. I'm not counting myself in that, but Jeff Noyce in chemistry, textbook author as well, pretty much shaped the way chemistry went for a long period until he retired. The UWCs were always a source of school-based syllabuses, which sometimes became full subjects, as world religions did from Atlantic College. Math studies, I'm told, started, Paul Belcher tells me, started at Atlantic College. And just recently, global politics, that subject is an amalgam of school-based syllabuses. It's got the Atlantic College inspired peace and conflict course in it. It's got the human rights course from Red Cross Nordic, and it's got a good measure of development, which came via economics and geography from an initiative in UWCs. So we are still influencing things. And finally, on that score, the IB is moving towards interdisciplinarity, because we did always teach our 6 subjects in silos, and the World Studies Extended Essay is a really good example of that. It was pioneered, sorry, that's me. It was pioneered by Mahindra and went on general offer 4 years ago. Sorry about that. So the World Studies Extended Essay, which is interdisciplinary, Global Politics, which is in effect interdisciplinary, they are UWC initiatives which are working themselves out right now through the IB.
Thanks, Gareth. Peter or Andrew, do you want to come in on that question, or shall I move on to another one?
No, I can pick up a little bit. Andrew has an even better story. When Pearson started, over half the registrants in the IB exam were UWC students. So Gareth's point has only become, more extreme in terms of us being minnows now as opposed to whales within the IB. But as Gareth notes, we did a survey probably about 10 years ago about the impact of UWC educators in the IB, and the percentage of all UWC or IB educators in various things like workshop leaders, course designers, et cetera, was about 3%, which was a huge number given the relatively small size of UWC within that system. So I think we have deep respect within the IB and continue to have that respect with the IB, which for me gives us that opportunity. I mean, I took a group to The Hague, where the world headquarters are now. I guess it was a couple of years ago. So it was in January 2019, and pitched to the then Director General, let us do the Diploma 2.0. And they have been very supportive of our initiative to develop, because they recognize, in a sense, that they're in a bit of a straitjacket, because the IB diploma remains the gold standard of international education. And you can't say it's not fit for purpose, but they recognize it needs to shift. They recognize the mental health situation with young people and the stress that this exam-based system has on them. But they can't jump to a new system without it being piloted and tested. And as Andrew said, in the early development, some failing taking place as well. So my pitch to them is we're uniquely placed as a group of 18 schools and colleges around the world with very diverse populations to develop a new approach. And as I said earlier, to buy time for our students. And I think that would be moving away from every course being a 2-year course that you have to deliver, that some courses could be 3 months. Others could be skill-based units that are around things like storytelling, 21st century skills that our students will need, because we don't know what the jobs of the 21st century are going to be. But what we do know is students have to be resilient, open to change, creative thinkers, critical thinkers, et cetera. And those are skills that can be taught. They've obviously been delivered historically through the program at AC. But I think the interdisciplinarity that Gareth was speaking about needs to populate not just the extended essay, but other subject curricula as well.
Thanks, Peter. That's helpful. And there's some remarks endorsing some of these points alumni, David Kay at Cornell, talking about interdisciplinary teaching, a couple of other people saying, you know, this is the way that at least higher education, certainly in the US, is trying to go. I'm not sure about the UK yet. Andrew, do you want to come in on that point?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Andrew Agerbak here, along with Rhoda, who was Rhoda Webb when Rhian-Anwen and I were together at AC at 83-85. So hello to Gareth and Roger and Jeff and others who taught us at the time, and to the embarrassing number of people who babysat me when I was 0 to 6 with my parents at AC 67 to 73. Maybe with that sort of long-term heritage in mind, there are certainly some alumni who feel like everything's completely gone downhill since we gave up morning swimming at 6:30 in the morning, and that's been, you know, death knell to the fabric, the very fabric of the college. Clearly, all institutions have to evolve, but maybe to make it a specific question, how has the college evolved the service proposition? Given, you know, the loss of the rescue services, you know, they were not the only services when I were there. We had the farm service and photographic service and social service, and I'm sure that's evolved, but I'd certainly be interested to hear how that evolution has continued.
Thank you, Andrew. Andrew Maclehose, what are your thoughts about the, I know you've kept closely in touch, services were such an important thing when you were there. Do you see students being stretched, albeit in different ways, to learn that sort of independence? What can you come in on that, Andrew Maclehose?
Well, if you like, just going back to the last question which you asked, you know, each generation of teachers has got to do its bit, right? And we were lucky enough to be involved in getting the IB going. Incidentally, when Atlantic College entered its first diploma candidates in '73, we had half the population of diploma candidates. '76, when Pearson entered its first candidates, again, we were virtually half the world total. But things have changed, obviously, and the present generation of teachers and students, indeed, have to move things along. No point in a lot of old fogies like me suggesting what should be done now.
You do yourself a disservice, Andrew, because Andrew, I think, is, well, he's the only teacher at AC who's taught in, I think, 7 or maybe 7 decades at the college. You taught in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 1000. So Andrew is the resident economist that we bring back. Gareth's too busy with the IB, so we can't drag him back in the classroom. But even as recently as a couple of years ago, Andrew came back, and something that really struck me, Andrew, that you said is the students are the same in the sense that they bring the same passion, they bring the same idealism, they care as deeply about the world as any generation of students. And I think we have to be careful not to forget that. I mean, we can throw everything under the bus in terms of how great it was in whatever generation. And I do think that the students of the 60s thought that the 70s had it too easy, and the students of the 70s thought the students of the 80s. But I think it's that passionate idealism that we always have to tap into. So with respect to the question around service, the rescue services are no longer, and as Gareth noted, and Andrew even earlier, they have become professionalized, and that's a good thing. You know, it's a good thing that the RNLI exists and has sea rescue and beach rescue and cliff rescue, and it's no longer reliant on the student population. And we do continue to train students to do beach rescue. We still give students boating training if they want to get their boating license, etc. But the why of the service has shifted much more towards social service. We had a review, I guess, 3 or 4 years ago, and it was chaired by students actually to do the service review. And one of the things that they wanted to bring back that had disappeared was a state service, which had stopped. So, you know, working with the stonemason in terms of doing some repairs of the staircases coming up from the jousting field to the top lawn, that sort of thing. But of course, the pandemic has really limited service now to be online for what we're doing. But we had a lovely initiative from students developing a civic education program for Welsh youth with the move to give the voting to 16-year-olds. And they really wanted to make sure that they were prepared to take on that responsibility. So there continues to be a really powerful social service movement. Music therapy is an incredible service that's offered here to the college, etc. We still teach swimming to local school children. We go into the primary schools, etc. So the service program remains timetabled, into the afternoons as it did before. But the rescue services, in terms of engagement with the sea, as we said, what we're working on is what's being called a Ways of Life program. And we just hired a seafront coordinator last term to really develop that program so that that re-engagement can take place.
Okay, thank you. Interesting question from Elda Mata, AC 7072, who I'm going to come to ask that question live around connecting with life before Atlantic College for a student. Can I do that, Elda? Are you there?
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Going about the issue isolation versus connectivity, let's say, I think it's a question perhaps of priorities. I do think that if we are absolutely connected with the outbounds of whatever UWC college we're in, we'll be missing the atmosphere of part of the atmosphere of the project. And also, if it's so easy to connect again with your friends elsewhere, solve your problems at home, etc., I think you're missing tremendously on your peers, on the people who are around you, your teachers, etc. So I do think it's not a question of controlling times, it's a question of managing times and connectivity according to priorities, in my opinion. Having time to spend in your own ambience with your friends, your colleagues, your fellow students, etc. I think that's essential to the project. So I'd be much in favor of not spending your afternoons or your evenings looking at a wall and with a iPhone or whatever you have in your hand. So we'd be missing a lot if that continues to be the way. That's my opinion anyway.
Elda, thank you. I'm going to ask Janice Truscott to say something because she had, I think, a slightly different perspective on technology. And I think we might be able to get both sides if I ask Janice to unmute. Yep. The fastest swimmer in the college when I was there.
Not anymore,
none. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Nice to see you all. I think I'm not going to disagree with Elda around, the importance of, the young people at Atlantic College or any other college, spending time with their colleagues and not on a screen the whole time. However, I think there's an opportunity to embrace technological advances and digitization for the better. And having had two children recently go through a UWC education, the last one left 4 years ago, so we're not bang up to date. I would say that, not only was the college perhaps not embracing it, but it was perhaps actually hindering their development versus, other education systems. And I think if we ignore that, we do so at our peril, because our young people will come out lacking a skill set that's essential in today's world. So I wonder how the perhaps changemaker curriculum or other service or social aspects could perhaps embrace the digital agenda for the better. And look at the opportunities it provides and, really drive that agenda to help the movement in addition to keeping our young people up to date. Just in terms of people keeping in touch, I have to say one of my children barely spoke to me for the whole 2 years he was at college. So he wasn't distracted by the fact that he could. And perhaps, it says something about the experience the child's having, frankly, if they're very, very regularly in contact at home. Maybe something's not right, but I think it can be embraced and a real benefit, actually.
Thank you. Janice, Peter.
I don't disagree with Janice. And in fact, one of the changemaker curricula that one of our maths teachers is working on with the students is big data decision-making for social change. And they're learning programming, amongst other things, in order to lean into it as opposed to run away from it. And, one of the revelations for me at Maastricht on the new campus, which was wired, to the limit and seamless Wi-Fi everywhere, is the availability did not take away from other things. Whereas when I arrived here, the idea if you had, Wi-Fi in the house, it would somehow destroy it. So we have massively increased access to digital. And of course, most of the material I would say that students now use is digital, you know, versus physical textbooks as it was back in the day. And I know one of the shocks for me going to Adriatic as an economics teacher is we basically had a bunch of old textbooks and we just let students choose which one do you want. But back in that day, that was before IB textbooks, at least they were listening to me and it was my notes that really mattered versus which textbook I handed out to them. So I think you're absolutely right. It's not running away from it, but I do think we also, in terms of what I would call a life skills program, have to be educating students around social media in particular. And I think that's something else I didn't touch upon, and we just don't know the impact, but of social media and this, you know, I do think a big part of the mental health challenge that young people face is they lead such a public life, but artificial in the sense of posting selfies about how happy they are all the time. But also that amongst the student population, I do have great faith in our students, but all of these closed Facebook groups, you know, and then students get worried that they're not in that group, that WhatsApp group or that chat group or what have you. So there's a lot of pressure that it's imposed. And I think we, as educators, at least speaking for myself, that are on the wrong side of the digital divide, have to be aware about how ubiquitous and central to their lives that it is, and not run away from it.
Yeah, I mean, we spent a lot of time being encouraged and encouraging each other not to be cliquey, as we called it. And in an era of identity politics, where young people are required to identify with groups so early, I often think about that kind of self-imposed morality that we were taught at Atlantic College not to be cliquey, and how in a way the world has sort of gone back backwards in that respect. I see so many comments and remarks. I'm very mindful of time. I'm going to let it run another 5 or 10 minutes. If you have to go, then obviously we understand. Someone here is saying it's wonderful to reconnect silently with Andrew. Colin Reed, great teacher, who I think is writing something at the moment, editing a book about David Sutcliffe. So obviously this community is sort of finding lots of little ways to connect between itself as we're talking, which is lovely. Andrew Maclehose, I just wanted to ask you, before I forget the point, that I think you did meet Kurt Hahn at some point back in the day, and I wondered if, you know, what would he think of Atlantic College these days, and what did he tell you, and what impact did he make on you?
Well, Kurt Hahn visited twice while I was there. He was really past his best. He became rather ill in his older days. And incidentally, I hope if you haven't read David Sutcliffe's book about Kurt Hahn and other founding fathers, there are still copies available in Atlantic College. Also, his book on the ILBs. Absolutely fantastic book, and I'm sure Peter Howe would be happy to give you a copy. Anyway, Kurt Hahn came, as I say, he was past his best. In those days, when I was housemaster, we had an all-boys house, which was quite normal then. And every Thursday evening or some such day, the students would be invited in if they wished to come to our house for coffee or cakes or whatever. And Kurt Hahn was there. And I'm extremely embarrassed to say that even though the boys weren't allowed to smoke in the dormitory, they were allowed to smoke in our house. Inconceivable for me to think that that was possible, but anyway, it did. And Kurt Hahn was clearly dismayed. Anyway, that was the first time. The second time he came, we were walking around by the seafront, and he told me a story which has affected me. I hope it has ever since. When he was headmaster of Gordonston, which was again was an all boys school, and his interest in education was really in boys' schools. He's told a story of a boy who was doing absolutely hopelessly at everything in the school, and he, Kurt Hahn, taught this boy how to tie fishing flies. I don't suppose people do that now, but when you went fishing, you had to tie the bits of feather and so on onto the hook. Anyway, this boy became so good at it that his whole life changed. He became academically successful, and according to Kurt Hahn, became a member of the Royal Society. And his point obviously was that for anybody who seems to be struggling generally, find something that they can do well, And this will, the confidence which this brings them, will spread out over their whole school life and indeed over their whole life in general. Anyway, those are my two recollections of Kurt Hahn.
Yeah, which very much endure, don't they? Particularly the second one. I'm going to close.
Rhian, can I just add a little bit?
Oh, of course you can, Roger.
Thank you. You didn't often allow me the chance to speak when you were in my house, if I remember.
Over to you.
I came to AC from a small town in mid-Wales in 1966, same time as Andrew, and it was an unbelievable eye-opener. And like him and Gareth, I just feel so privileged to have been there. Kurt Hahn came in my first year. He sneaked into the college. We were having lunch in the dining hall, and in those days there was a top table for the staff, which was approximately 10 centimeters higher than the rest of us hoi polloi sat at. And Kurt Hahn arrived, quietly took his lunch. The next minute there was a great furore as the Rear Admiral arrived to find Kurt Hahn there. He was such a quiet man and so deep, and he did so much. Well worth reading his story. Andrew had the dubious privilege of teaching me philosophy in the first year as a subsidiary subject, which may explain why I became a mathematician.
Roger, lovely to hear from you. Thank you very much. I just want to read this wonderful comment from David Rogers. I'm really ancient, 1963 to 65, but I remember the excitement of being part of a living experiment where things went wrong more often than they went right, but that did not seem to matter. I suspect there's now a greater expectation of professionalism. Oh, and in 1965, Kurt Hahn driving in his Bentley along narrow Welsh lanes was absolutely terrifying. That's a wonderful comment. I think I'm going to ask one more person to speak, if I may. Zoltan, 1983, 1985. Hello, good to see you. Please, can we unmute your microphone? Because I don't have a chance of precising the 5 questions that you've put into the chat. So I'm going to let you do it, Zoltan. If you can unmute your microphone.
Yeah. Hi. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good to see you. God bless you all. I mean, I'm really getting 30 years younger every minute. Great to see you. And thank you very much for everything I got from this Harry Potter type experience that I had and shared with you. The questions that I put mainly tackle the tension between the philanthropic mission, the original mission of the UWC and Atlantic College, and the business-like mission of the IBO. So there is a clear tension between, and there is a clear barrier to the spread and to the objective of keeping this huge advantage that we had back in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, perhaps 90s as well. But now there is a huge competition. It's a competitive, global, international educational frame and context that we are in. I'm working with the European Parliament and with the OECD, and it's reality. Of course, UWC and Atlantic College has huge credits to this development, but now it faces huge challenges as well. And as an old boy, if I may, and also as a teacher and also as a parent of 4, I'm a bit saddened by this development. And in Hungary, with Andrew Stewart and also Gareth visiting Hungary back in when the Ancien regime fell in 1989, we had an initiative to import Atlantic College and UWC to Lake Balaton, to Hungary, and tried to establish the first Eastern European UWC there. We failed because of the conservative attitude of the government of Hungary then. But now we would be very, very happy to, to have some kind of a new positive message, especially in this COVID crisis. Crisis is always an opportunity. We just remember the victims of COVID yesterday. I saw the beautiful picture of Atlantic College yesterday, lit up in yellow or gold. And we did the same in Hungary. And we sent a message to parents and the community in Hungary. What is, and that's an additional question, I'm sorry about that, then I stop. I'm a bit too talkative these days when I see you. What is the message of AC for a post-COVID world? Thank you.
Thank you, Zoltan. Thank you so much. Great to see you. I'm going to ask one of you three, Gareth, Peter, Andrew, if you'd like to comment to close. What's the message in this post-COVID time that you feel Atlantic College UWC has to share?
I think I'd leave that to the people who are there, can do something practical.
Thanks, Andrew. I think it's a really humbling question, Zoltan, and thank you. I think accessibility, and that doesn't just mean physically being able to get to there. One of the amazing NGOs that's come out of UWC is Amala. It's a UWC Atlantic alum and a Mahindra College alum who are providing online education to refugees, as opposed to, rescuing them and bringing them around the world to going where they are. But one of the ideas, the UWC governance meetings took place a couple of weeks ago, and one of the ideas that the pandemic has really brought to the fore is the idea of having a global campus in the sense of an online presence, and increase accessibility of UWC courses, whether it be short courses, critical engagement, skill-based units that others could access. And it wouldn't just be those who have the privilege of attending UWC who could access some of the learning and thinking that's going around that. And it's my real hope. I haven't heard the outcome of the board meeting of the last couple of weeks, but we as a group of heads really wanted education to be at the heart of UWC International again, as opposed to, the broader enterprise. Because once again, I think we have a unique opportunity in the next 3 to 5 years to be really driving innovation in education, but it has to be, if not a singular focus, pretty much a singular focus. It's not something that we can wait around to do. So I think there has to be a sense of urgency with respect to that.
I think I'm very tempted to leave it there, because I think that's a wonderful way to close, Peter. And I think we all hope that that will be one of the things that you leave behind when you move on to a warmer island. And we thank you for everything you've done while you've been with UWC, while you've been with Atlantic College. So thank you very much to the well over 100 people that we've had on this call. It's been an absolute pleasure to see so many old friends, and also to have the dialogue happen between you guys, as opposed to from the screen out towards you. So thank you very much indeed, and have a lovely evening, and please come back to us next time.
Thank you, Rhian, and I'm really blessed to have Andrew and Gareth as my neighbors.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this InTalk series. Thank you, Rhian. Thank you, Gareth, Andrew, and Peter. It's been brilliant to have you. Some of the stories I think some of us would have never heard before, so it's been really good to hear. Just to let everyone know that this InTouch series of talks will be hosted throughout the year, touching sort of various aspects of what UWC Atlantic is, sort of student life, and quite a few different things, so people can get a real sense of it. We'll be sharing further details of that sort of down the line. Our next In Conversation talk will be with one of our UWC Atlantic alums, which will be on the 8th of April. And we'll actually be sharing the invites to those in the coming days. We hope you join us for that. We hope you've enjoyed today. and we hope you continue to come back and enjoy these talks with us. So once again, thank you everyone for attending, and we hope you really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Keith, just before you go, I just want to say that in the chat, there are 2 people, and Andrew warned me about this beforehand, and I did mention it, but I'll just mention it specifically again. There are 2 people talking about working on a book or a collation of works about David Sutcliffe. And so I invite both those people. I think Colin Reed is one. Very good to see you. Andrew Maclehose told me about you. And then there is another student, Dag Finn Paust, who wants to also be connected. So maybe if you could contact Keith or the college, we can try and put you together, and we look forward to seeing the results of those efforts going on at the moment.
Yeah, brilliant. I've spoken to Dagvin previously, but yeah, if you both want to sort of get in touch, or if you want to sort of connect, do pop us through an email. You can respond to the email that sends across all the details for this talk, and we'll be able to share with you anything that you guys might need, or if there's anything we can help you with. But once again, thank you, and we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you continue to come back and enjoy the future events that we're hosting.
Thanks, Keith. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.